What if the most ancient writings ever passed down from generation to generation were not merely stories about a distant past, but a living portrait of humanity itself? What if these texts were not locked behind ancient languages, stone tablets, or distant rituals, but pulsing with relevance today, right now? Imagine a book that spans centuries, yet speaks to the heart as though it were written this morning. That book exists. It is the Old Testament. Far too often, people approach the Old Testament as if it were a museum exhibit. They see it as a collection of old laws, strange customs, and names difficult to pronounce. Dusty, hard to read, sometimes even harsh. But what if all of that changed? What if the Old Testament was not about an ancient people, but about you? About your longings, your failures, your hunger for justice, your search for identity, your questions about why the world is the way it is? What if this vast collection of 39 books, written over 1,000 years, was actually one unified story with a pulse, a breath, a heartbeat? This video does not approach the Old Testament as a textbook. It is not a theological lecture. It is an invitation to journey through a landscape that is raw, wild, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying. The Old Testament is not a myth. It is not a fairy tale. It is a record of humanity grappling with the divine. It contains tales of creation and destruction, of exile and return, of weeping and dancing. It is filled with broken people who encounter a holy God. It contains some of the most sublime poetry ever written and some of the most sobering warnings ever spoken. At its core, the Old Testament is not just a religious document. It is the beginning of the human story. It begins before there were nations, before there were borders, before there were kings or temples. It begins with light, and then quickly with the fall of that light. It is a mirror that reflects not only the best of what we long for, but also the darkness we often carry inside. It is the history of a chosen people, but it is also a revelation about all people. It captures the ache of humanity for meaning, for justice, for hope, and ultimately for redemption. What makes this book extraordinary is that it is not merely descriptive, it is prophetic. It does not just tell us what happened, it shows us what is always happening. Rebellion, mercy, judgment, deliverance. It is a cycle we see again and again, but not a cycle without purpose. Through every fall, there is a whisper of a promise. Through every failure, a thread of grace. This is a book filled with covenants, with divine intervention, with burning questions and unexpected answers. And at every step, it points beyond itself, to something more, to someone more. The Old Testament is composed of many different types of writing. Historical accounts that trace the rise and fall of kingdoms, legal codes that shaped a nation, songs that echo the deepest cries of the human soul, prophecies that pierce time with startling accuracy and poetic power. Every book, every passage, every name contributes to a tapestry that is both fragile and unbreakable. It is the divine reaching into the human. It is heaven speaking into earth. One of the greatest misunderstandings of the Old Testament is to see it as outdated. But once it is understood not just as a sequence of ancient rules and rituals, but as a story, a divine drama, everything changes. Its pages are filled with themes that still define human life: betrayal and loyalty, war and peace, despair and hope. These are not foreign concepts, they are our daily reality, and what this book does is place them in a divine context. It reveals what it means to be human under the gaze of eternity. And while the Old Testament ends long before the New Testament begins, it never feels like an ending, because it was never meant to be an ending. It was meant to prepare, to point, to stir, to ignite a longing that has not been fully satisfied. It carries the weight of anticipation, a sense that something more is coming, something greater. The Old Testament is not just the beginning of a book, it is the beginning of a movement, a whisper of the divine plan unfolding one word at a time. In this video, we will walk through every major movement of the Old Testament, not just with dates and facts, but with heart and insight. We will move from creation to exile, from promise to restoration. We will see how each book, even the obscure ones, fits into a larger picture. This is not a collection of disconnected stories. This is one story told many times, through many lives in many ways. A story that does not begin with man reaching up, but with God reaching down. So take a deep breath. Open your mind, but also your heart. Let go of assumptions. Let the text speak, because once the layers are peeled back and the thread is found, you will see something that has always been there, but perhaps never understood like this. The Old Testament is not just about then, it is about now, it is about you. Before there were nations or laws or written scriptures, before there were commandments or sacrifices, there was a world spoken into existence by the sheer force of divine intent. Genesis begins not with confusion or battle, as some ancient mythologies do, but with order emerging from chaos, light from darkness, beauty from barrenness. The first words carry both simplicity and weight. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It is a beginning not only of physical matter, but of purpose. The universe, according to this sacred narrative, was not an accident, nor a product of conflict, but a deliberate act of harmony and design. The days of creation unfold like the strokes of a master artist. Light is separated from darkness. Waters are gathered and divided. Land emerges. Each phase builds upon the previous, as sky, sea, and earth take shape. Vegetation springs forth. Stars are hung in place. The rhythms of days and seasons begin their ceaseless dance. Birds fill the skies, fish glide through the depths, and animals roam the earth. But all of it moves toward a crescendo. On the sixth day, something different happens. From the dust of the ground, a human form is shaped, not merely formed, but breathed into. The breath is not just air, but life, spirit, identity. Man and woman are not afterthoughts. They are the crowning expression of a creation declared good. In the Garden of Eden, the first humans experienced something we struggle to comprehend: unbroken fellowship with God, creation, and each other. They live without shame, without fear, without the burden of mortality. They walk with God, not metaphorically, but literally. The garden is not simply a paradise of abundance, it is a sanctuary of innocence. Yet even in this place, there is a boundary, a single tree, a single command, not because God desires arbitrary control, but because love, to be real, must have a choice. That choice is made, and everything changes. Temptation does not arrive as open rebellion, but as a question, an insinuation that maybe God is holding something back. The serpent, subtle and strategic, twists the divine command and introduces doubt. The woman eats, the man follows, and for the first time, the world knows disobedience. Eyes are opened, but not to freedom, to shame. They cover themselves not out of modesty, but because innocence has died. And when God calls, they hide, not because he has changed, but because they have. The consequences are swift and devastating. The relationship between humans and God is ruptured. The ground itself is cursed. Pain, toil, and mortality enter the human story. The harmony that defined Eden is fractured, and yet, in the middle of judgment, a promise is whispered. Speaking to the serpent, God declares that one day the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. In that single sentence lies the first flicker of hope, a hint that this story, though broken, is not beyond repair. As the human story continues beyond the garden, the impact of sin becomes more visible. Cain, the firstborn of Adam and Eve, murders his own brother in a fit of jealousy. The ground, once cursed for Adam's sake, now drinks Abel's blood. It is not a small or isolated failure. It is a signal that sin is not merely a mistake, but a spreading corruption. Generations pass, and humanity grows not just in number, but in violence. By the time of Noah, the earth is filled with wickedness, and every inclination of the human heart is described as evil continually. God grieves. The Creator mourns over what has become of his creation. But even here, mercy finds a vessel. Noah is described as righteous in his generation, and through him, God preserves a remnant. The flood is both judgment and renewal. The world is not destroyed in rage, but cleansed with sorrow. The ark floats not merely as a lifeboat, but as a symbol of divine preservation. Rain falls for 40 days, waters cover the mountains, and silence reigns. When the waters recede and Noah steps onto dry ground, he builds an altar. And God responds with a covenant. Never again will he destroy the earth with a flood. A rainbow is set in the clouds as a sign, not for man to remember God, but for God to remember his mercy. Still, the human heart has not changed. Noah plants a vineyard and becomes drunk. His sons react in different ways, revealing once more the complexity of righteousness and shame. The narrative moves quickly through generations, tracing the development of nations and languages. Yet rebellion takes on a new form at the Tower of Babel. This time, humanity does not sin in violence or pleasure, but in ambition. They seek to make a name for themselves, to reach heaven by their own effort, to unify around pride rather than purpose. And so God confuses their language, scattering them across the earth. The tower remains unfinished, a monument not to human greatness, but to human arrogance. In just 11 chapters, Genesis lays the foundation for everything that follows. It reveals the character of God as creator, judge, and redeemer. It exposes the human tendency toward rebellion and the divine inclination toward mercy. It introduces themes of covenant, sacrifice, justice, and grace. The fall from Eden is not a distant myth. It is the echo that runs through every human heart. The longing to return, to walk again in peace with God, to be unashamed, to be whole. That longing is the silent cry behind every story in the Old Testament. Genesis 1 to 11 is not a separate introduction. It is the seedbed of Scripture. Every later chapter grows from its soil, and even in its darkest moments, there is always a thread of hope. That one day the serpent would be crushed, that one day exile would end, that one day Eden might not be a memory, but a future. When the dust of Babel settled and the languages of men scattered across the earth, the stage quietly shifted from the collective story of humanity to the intimate story of one man. Among the nations and tribes rising across the ancient Near East, a divine voice called out. Not to a king or priest or warrior, but to a man named Abram, dwelling in Ur of the Chaldeans. There was no prelude, no introduction, only a call. Leave your country, your kindred, and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. It was not a demand backed by threats, but a summons backed by promise. Abram, later renamed Abraham, responded not with full understanding or flawless faith, but with willingness. This response is what would define his legacy and alter the trajectory of history. God promised to make of him a great nation, to bless him, to make his name great, and through him to bless all the families of the earth. These were not the declarations of a tribal deity, but the covenantal vision of a God with global intention. The covenant established with Abraham was not just about land or offspring. It was about relationship, destiny, and a coming redemption that would ultimately extend far beyond Abraham's descendants. Abraham's journey was far from simple. He traveled through unfamiliar lands, endured famines, and wrestled with fear. Twice, he passed off his wife Sarah as his sister to foreign rulers, placing her and the promise in jeopardy. Yet despite these failures, God remained faithful. This is one of the most remarkable aspects of the Abrahamic narrative. Not that Abraham never failed, but that God's promise never did. The covenant was not conditional on perfection, but on divine commitment. Years passed, and the promise of a child seemed impossible. Abraham and Sarah, aging and barren, could not see how a great nation could come from a womb that had never known life. In desperation, they turned to Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian maidservant. Ishmael was born, and with him came tension, jealousy, and strife. But God had not forgotten Sarah. In her old age she conceived and gave birth to Isaac, the child of promise. His name, meaning laughter, reflected both the incredulity and the joy of a fulfillment long awaited. Isaac, though less prominent in the narrative, represents the continuation of the covenant. His life was marked by moments of peace and conflict, particularly with the surrounding peoples over wells and land. He married Rebekah, and they had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. While Esau was the firstborn, Jacob would become the inheritor of the promise, not through merit, but through divine election and a series of deeply human, often questionable choices. Jacob's life was one of struggle and transformation. He deceived his brother, tricked his father, and fled into exile. Yet in exile he encountered the divine, a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, angels ascending and descending, and the voice of God reaffirming the promise made to Abraham and Isaac. This moment at Bethel was more than a vision. It was an invitation to transformation. Later, in a nighttime encounter by the Jabbok River, Jacob wrestled with a mysterious figure until dawn. He limped away with a new name, Israel. The deceiver became the contender, the one who strives with God. His life, marked by both cunning and suffering, became the foundation for a people who would bear his name. Jacob's 12 sons would become the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. Among them was Joseph, a dreamer, favored and envied. Betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and imprisoned in Egypt, Joseph's life seemed to unravel at every turn. But his story was not one of abandonment. It was one of providence. Through a series of extraordinary events, Joseph rose to power in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. He interpreted dreams, predicted famine, and ultimately saved not only Egypt, but also his own family from starvation. When Joseph revealed his identity to his brothers, he spoke words that echo with divine perspective. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." This moment is pivotal, for it shows that even the darkest human intentions can become instruments of redemption in the hands of a sovereign God. The family that once fractured now reunites in Egypt, a foreign land that would become both their refuge and, eventually, their crucible. Throughout the lives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, a pattern emerges. Human frailty does not cancel divine purpose. The covenant remains unshaken, not because the patriarchs are flawless, but because the one who made the covenant is faithful. These stories are not tales of perfect obedience, but of persistent grace. They reveal a God who chooses the unlikely, who works through mess and missteps, and who honors promises even when the recipients do not fully understand them. The birth of this nation begins not with power, but with promise, not with strength, but with surrender, not with a throne, but with tents in a desert. The story of Israel is born out of faith, sometimes fragile, often tested, but always met with divine assurance. Through this family, a nation would rise. Through this nation, the world would one day see salvation. Centuries after Joseph's death, Egypt was no longer a land of refuge for the descendants of Jacob. What had once been a place of provision had become a house of bondage. A new Pharaoh, unaware of Joseph's legacy, viewed the growing Hebrew population not as honored guests, but as a threat. Fear turned to policy, and policy to oppression. The Hebrews were enslaved, their labor exploited to build the monuments of empire. Their cries rose from the fields and brickyards, not as political protest, but as prayers forged in suffering. And heaven heard. Into this world of anguish, a child was born, hidden in a basket of reeds and placed in the Nile, not to die, but to be rescued. Pharaoh's daughter found him, raised him as her own, and named him Moses. Though he grew up surrounded by Egyptian luxury, Moses never fully belonged. He carried within him a buried awareness of his people's pain. One day, in a moment of anger and identity, he killed an Egyptian taskmaster and fled into the wilderness. It would take 40 years in Midian for Moses to be reshaped, not as a prince or fugitive, but as a shepherd, humbled and quieted. Then came the fire that did not consume. On the far side of the desert, Moses encountered a bush engulfed in flames, yet untouched by them. From within the fire, the voice of God called his name. This was no ordinary moment, it was a divine appointment. God declared himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, reminding Moses that the covenant still lived, even if the people were in chains. The mission was clear: return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh, not as a negotiator, but as a messenger. Moses hesitated, questioned, resisted, yet God would not relent. A shepherd would become a deliverer, not by strength, but by obedience. Pharaoh's heart was not softened by polite appeals. The confrontation between Moses and the Egyptian king was not merely political, it was spiritual. Each of the 10 plagues that struck Egypt was a direct challenge to the gods of the land. The Nile turned to blood, frogs filled the houses, darkness covered the sun, and finally, the firstborn sons perished. These were not random acts of destruction. They were signs, declarations that the God of Israel was not a regional deity, but the Lord over all creation. At the heart of this conflict stood the Passover. On the night when death would pass through Egypt, the Hebrews were instructed to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb. This act, both symbolic and literal, became a turning point. Death passed over the homes marked by obedience and faith. This moment would become the foundation of their collective memory, a ritual repeated year after year, not to relive trauma, but to remember deliverance. When the final plague broke Pharaoh's resistance, he commanded the Hebrews to leave. What had taken generations to build collapsed in a night. The Exodus was not just an escape, it was a revelation. God led his people not on the shortest route, but through the wilderness, guiding them with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. When the Egyptian army pursued, the people panicked. But the Red Sea stood not as a barrier, but as a stage. The waters parted, and the Israelites crossed on dry ground. When Pharaoh's chariots followed, the waters returned, and the might of Egypt was swallowed in silence. This was not a military victory, it was a divine act. Israel was not simply freed, they were reborn. In the desert, they reached Mount Sinai, where the presence of God descended with fire and thunder. This was not spectacle for its own sake. It was the moment of covenant renewal. The people who had known slavery now stood as a nation before their God. From the mountain, God gave his law, not as a burden, but as a gift. The 10 Commandments were not arbitrary rules, but the framework for a just and holy society. They revealed the heart of God and the shape of human dignity. The giving of the law marked Israel's transformation from a group of freed slaves into a covenant people. The law covered worship, justice, purity, and compassion. It was not simply about moral behavior, but about identity. Israel was to be a holy nation, a light to the surrounding peoples, a living demonstration of what it meant to live in relationship with the divine. The tabernacle, with its detailed instructions and sacred rituals, became the center of worship, reminding the people that God dwelled among them, but also that access to him required reverence. Yet even in this sacred moment, human nature revealed itself. While Moses was on the mountain, receiving divine instruction, the people below fashioned a golden calf and called it their god. Their impatience turned to idolatry. The scene is jarring, not just because of the rebellion, but because it comes so soon after their miraculous deliverance. Still, God did not abandon them. Though judgment came, so did intercession. Moses pleaded for mercy, and God relented, reaffirming his covenant and revealing his name as gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love. The story of Moses and the Exodus is not only about liberation from physical bondage, it is about spiritual formation. A people once crushed by tyranny now walked with purpose. Their past was marked by oppression, but their future was shaped by promise. The journey from Egypt to Sinai was not merely geographical, it was transformational. They were being taught to trust, to listen, to worship. The fire of Sinai was not just divine power, it was divine invitation. In this chapter of sacred history, God is not distant or silent. He hears the cries of the oppressed. He speaks from fire. He acts in judgment and mercy. He reveals his will not only through miracles, but through law, through covenant, through relationship. The story of the Exodus is one of the most defining narratives in all of Scripture, and its echoes are heard throughout the rest of the Old Testament. It is the moment when a family became a nation, when slaves became sons and daughters, when a promise took on flesh and history. What should have been a journey measured in weeks became a lifetime wandering through a vast and unforgiving wilderness. The road from Egypt to Canaan was not primarily about geography. It was about transformation. The Exodus had freed the Israelites from their physical chains, but the wilderness was where the deeper chains of fear, mistrust, and rebellion would be exposed. Every step forward became a test of faith, every hardship a mirror held up to the soul of a people not yet ready to inherit the promise. From the beginning, the wilderness journey revealed more than terrain. It revealed character. The people who had seen the Red Sea part and Pharaoh's army crushed under its returning waves soon found themselves murmuring over water, food, and leadership. The God who had provided freedom was now questioned for every delay, every discomfort. Manna fell from the sky, enough for each day, but they grew tired of its sameness. Water flowed from rocks, yet still they doubted. They longed for Egypt, not because it was better, but because it was familiar. Freedom demanded faith, and that was something they had not yet learned to carry. The Book of Numbers records not only the logistics of travel, but the deep undercurrents of resistance that ran through the heart of the camp. When spies were sent to survey the land of Canaan, only two, Joshua and Caleb, returned with confidence. The others, overwhelmed by the giants they saw, spread fear instead of faith. Their report ignited panic, and once again the people turned against Moses, longing to return to Egypt. In that moment, the cost of disobedience was sealed. God declared that none of that generation, except the faithful two, would enter the land of promise. The journey would continue, but it would stretch across decades, with the wilderness becoming both a graveyard for the faithless and a classroom for those who would follow. Leadership itself was tested under the weight of constant complaint and defiance. Moses, who had interceded, wept, pleaded, and led with unimaginable patience, faced rebellion from within his own tribe. Even his siblings, Miriam and Aaron, challenged his authority. When Korah led an uprising against Moses and Aaron, questioning their leadership and accusing them of exalting themselves, the earth opened and swallowed the rebels. It was not simply about hierarchy, it was about resisting the authority God had established. Leadership in the wilderness was not about power, but burden. Moses carried it not as a crown, but as a cross. Even Moses, the man who had spoken with God face to face, would falter. In a moment of frustration, when the people once again cried out for water, he struck the rock in anger instead of speaking to it, as God had commanded. This act of disobedience, seemingly small compared to the people's countless rebellions, carried a heavy consequence. God told him he would see the promised land from afar, but not enter it. It was a sobering reminder that no one stood above the standard of divine holiness, not even the chosen leader. And yet, through all the grumbling, rebellion, and consequences, God's presence remained. The pillar of cloud by day and fire by night did not depart. Manna continued to fall. Water still flowed. Their clothes did not wear out. Their feet did not swell. Every act of provision was an act of patience. The wilderness was not a place of abandonment. It was a place of divine faithfulness tested against human frailty. The book of Deuteronomy, delivered near the journey's end, captures the heart of Moses as he prepares the next generation to enter the land. It is not just a restatement of the law. It is a call to remember. Again and again, Moses exhorts the people to remember where they came from, what they had seen, and who had carried them. He warns them not to forget when they settle in homes they did not build, eat from vineyards they did not plant, and enjoy the blessings they did not earn. The danger of forgetting is greater than the danger of enemies. Memory is what binds them to obedience. Deuteronomy also introduces one of the most powerful themes in all of Scripture, the idea of the heart. Moses speaks of circumcising the heart, of loving God with all one's heart, soul, and strength. The wilderness had been about reshaping not only habits, but affections. The people were to be a holy nation, not just by ritual, but by love. Love expressed through loyalty, justice, and worship. As the chapter closes, Moses stands on the edge of the promised land. He sees it from Mount Nebo, but knows he will not enter. His final words are not bitter. They are full of hope and warning. He blesses the tribes, commissions Joshua, and entrusts the future to the next generation. The wilderness years become more than a delay. They become a crucible. The fire of trial revealed the impurities of the heart, but also forged a people who had learned, through wandering and loss, what it meant to trust the one who had never left them. The land that had been spoken of for generations, promised to Abraham, envisioned by Moses, and longed for by a wandering people, finally lay within reach. Canaan was not an abstraction, not a dream, but a real land with fortified cities, established cultures, and deeply rooted traditions. It was fertile, rich, and contested. As Joshua stood poised to lead the people across the Jordan, the weight of the moment pressed in from every direction. This was more than a military campaign. It was the fulfillment of covenant, the test of faith, and the collision of kingdoms, one defined by divine promise, the other by entrenched idolatry and violence. Joshua, having served faithfully under Moses, now carried the mantle of leadership. But he did not carry it in his own strength. Before the conquest began, he encountered a mysterious figure, a man with a drawn sword who identified himself as commander of the army of the Lord. When Joshua asked if he was for Israel or their enemies, the answer came not with partisanship, but with authority. Neither, but as commander of the Lord's host I have now come. This encounter reframed the entire mission. Israel was not enlisting God in their cause. They were being summoned to align with his purposes. The conquest was not about national expansion. It was about divine judgment and promise unfolding in real history. The fall of Jericho stands as the most iconic episode in this campaign. The strategy made no military sense. March around the city for 6 days in silence, then on the 7th day, march 7 times and shout. But the victory was not in the tactics. It was in obedience. The walls collapsed not by siege engines, but by faith. Jericho's destruction was total. Yet within its doomed walls, a single family was spared. Rahab, a prostitute who had sheltered the Israelite spies, had declared her belief in the God of Israel. Her faith, though born in fear, placed her among the redeemed. Her name would not only be remembered, it would later appear in the genealogy of Jesus. Following Jericho, the conquest advanced, but not without setbacks. At Ai, Israel suffered an unexpected defeat. The reason was soon revealed. A man named Ashan had taken items from Jericho that had been placed under divine ban. His private greed had brought public consequences. When judgment fell, it was severe, but it restored the integrity of the community. This episode served as a sobering reminder that the conquest was not a license for personal gain, but a sacred mission carried out under divine scrutiny. As the tribes moved through the land, victories continued, but so did questions. Why did God command the total destruction of certain cities? What about the lives of the Canaanites? These questions are not ignored or softened by the text. They sit uncomfortably, challenging the modern reader to grapple with the historical and theological context of the ancient world. The Canaanite cultures were deeply entwined with practices of child sacrifice, temple prostitution, and violence that desecrated life and degraded humanity. God's judgment was not arbitrary. It was measured, deliberate, and carried out through a people who themselves were not morally superior, but chosen for a purpose. Still, the conquest was not uniform or complete. Many cities remained unconquered. Some Canaanite groups were left in the land either by compromise, fear, or treaty. The Gibeonites, for example, deceived the Israelites into making a covenant with them, and though the deception was later revealed, the agreement was honored. This blend of divine directive, human decision, and complex outcomes reveals the layered nature of the narrative. The conquest was not a simple tale of good versus evil. It was a dynamic unfolding of judgment, mercy, and human responsibility. The book of Joshua does not end with endless battles. It moves toward distribution and settlement. The land is divided among the tribes, each receiving their portion, each tasked with taking full possession. Some succeeded, others faltered. The Levites, serving as priests, received no territory but were scattered throughout the land in cities, ensuring that the presence of the Lord's instruction would permeate the nation. The tabernacle was set up in Shiloh, and the covenant was renewed. Joshua gathered the people and reminded them that their success did not come from their might, but from the faithfulness of God. He urged them to choose whom they would serve and to remember all that the Lord had done. Before his death, Joshua spoke words that echoed across time. "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." This declaration was not only a personal commitment, but a challenge to a nation whose future would depend not just on territory held, but on hearts surrendered. The conquest of Canaan was a beginning, not an end. The land had been entered, the covenant reaffirmed, the tribes settled, but the real test would come not in battlefields but in daily choices, in loyalty to the one who had given them both freedom and a home. The dust of conquest had barely settled when the cracks in Israel's resolve began to widen. The people had entered the land, claimed their inheritance, and witnessed the faithfulness of their God in battle and provision. Yet once the immediate threats had subsided and the sense of urgency began to fade, so too did their commitment. The period that followed, known as the time of the Judges, presents one of the most unsettling and revealing portraits in all of Scripture. A generation untethered from its foundations, drifting deeper into moral confusion and spiritual forgetfulness. There was no central authority, no reigning king, and no consistent leadership to anchor the people. Each tribe settled into its allotted territory, and as generations passed, the memory of covenant gave way to the pressures and seductions of surrounding cultures. The text repeats a haunting refrain. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This was not the freedom of moral clarity, but the anarchy of spiritual blindness. The result was a society in flux, vulnerable not only to foreign oppression, but to internal decay. The Book of Judges captures this reality in a series of cycles, repetitions of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance. Each cycle begins with the people turning away from God, often by embracing the idols of the nations around them. Baal and Asherah, gods of fertility and war, were worshipped with rituals that violated every principle of holiness given at Sinai. As a result, God allowed their enemies to rise and afflict them. Suffering brought remembrance, and remembrance led to cries for help. God, ever merciful, raised up judges, not judges in the modern legal sense, but deliverers and leaders, men and women who would guide the people back, at least for a time. These judges were rarely perfect. In fact, their flaws are often as prominent as their victories. Yet through them, God demonstrated his willingness to work through the broken, the hesitant, and the impulsive. Deborah, one of the earliest and most remarkable figures in this era, stood out not only as a prophetess, but as a leader in a male-dominated culture. When Barak hesitated to lead Israel into battle without her, Deborah agreed to go, but declared that the glory would not go to him. The enemy general Sisera was eventually defeated, not by a warrior, but by a woman named Jael, who drove a tent peg through his skull. The irony, boldness, and unexpected nature of these victories underscore the way God subverted human expectations again and again. Gideon, another judge, began his journey hiding in a winepress, fearful and unsure. When an angel greeted him with the words, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior," it was not a reflection of Gideon's current courage, but a declaration of what he was being called to become. Even when Gideon obeyed and tore down the altar of Baal in his father's house, he did it under the cover of night. He asked for signs twice before stepping into leadership, yet God honored his faith, however trembling. With only 300 men, Gideon defeated a Midianite army too numerous to count, armed with trumpets and torches hidden in jars. But even Gideon, in his later years, stumbled. He fashioned an ephod that became a snare for his family, drawing the people back into idolatry. His legacy, like the era he lived in, was mixed, marked by both faith and failure. Samson's story, perhaps the most well-known, reads like a tragic epic. Chosen before birth, set apart by a Nazirite vow, endowed with supernatural strength, Samson embodied the potential of divine calling, corrupted by personal weakness. He fought the Philistines with fearless power, but lived with reckless desire. His attraction to foreign women, disregard for his vow, and explosive temper made him as much a threat to himself as to his enemies. Yet in the end, blind and humiliated, Samson cried out to God one final time. His death brought down the temple of Dagon and killed more Philistines than he had in his life. Even in ruin, his story reflected the possibility of redemption, a reminder that grace is not reserved for the blameless. Throughout this era, the people of Israel continued to fluctuate between dependence and defiance. The judges themselves became increasingly flawed as the narrative progressed, culminating in episodes of brutality and chaos that shock even modern readers. The Levite and his concubine, a story found near the end of Judges, portrays a society unraveling. A woman is abused and murdered. A nation nearly collapses into civil war, and the boundaries between justice and vengeance blur beyond recognition. Yet even in this darkness, the presence of God does not fully withdraw. His response is not indifference, but grief. He continues to raise up leaders, continues to answer the cries of his people. What this era reveals most clearly is not the instability of society alone, but the persistence of divine mercy. Over and over, God steps into a fractured situation and brings deliverance, not because the people deserve it, but because he remains faithful to his covenant. The period of the Judges was a time of broken cycles, of fleeting revivals, followed by deeper plunges into chaos. It shows what happens when a people forget their story, their covenant and their God, but it also reveals that no matter how far they fall, the whisper of grace remains. The hearts of the people may wander, but the heart of God continues to pursue. It is in this volatile setting that the longing for a different kind of leadership begins to emerge, a yearning not just for deliverance, but for a king. The cry for a king did not rise from a vacuum. After generations of instability under the judges and the moral disintegration that followed, the people of Israel looked outward and saw something they lacked: monarchs who commanded armies, ruled from palaces, and brought national cohesion. They approached the prophet Samuel not to ask for God's direction, but to demand a king to rule over them like all the other nations. It was a plea born not from trust in divine provision, but from fear and comparison. Though grieved by the request, Samuel was told by God to grant it, for in rejecting Samuel's leadership, the people had ultimately rejected their true king. Saul, the first to wear the crown, stood tall and impressive, chosen not merely for his appearance, but for the potential he carried. In the beginning, he showed promise, even humility. He won battles, rallied tribes, and gave Israel a central figure to follow. But the throne exposed what the heart concealed. Saul's insecurity, masked by moments of boldness, grew into a need for control, fear of man, and disregard for divine instruction. When instructed by Samuel to wait before offering sacrifice, Saul acted rashly. When told to utterly destroy Amalek, he spared the best and justified his actions. In these moments, God's regret over Saul's kingship was not due to failure alone, but to rebellion cloaked in rationalization. Saul could not be trusted with power because he could not surrender it. While Saul still reigned, a shepherd boy was anointed in secret. David, the youngest son of Jesse, had no claim to greatness in human terms. Yet he carried a heart after God's own. His rise began not in royal courts, but on battlefields and in wilderness hideouts. He slew Goliath not because he sought fame, but because he could not abide a challenge to God's honor. As he played music to soothe Saul's tormented spirit, and as he fled from Saul's jealousy, David's character was forged. He refused to lift his hand against the Lord's anointed, even when he had every opportunity. His patience, integrity, and worship made him not only a capable leader, but a man shaped by devotion. David's reign, though marked by military success and national expansion, was not free from tragedy. His sin with Bathsheba, the murder of her husband Uriah, and the resulting judgment brought pain not only to his house, but to the entire kingdom. His family life unraveled. One son raped his sister, another killed his brother, and still another led a revolt against him. Yet in the depths of his failure, David did not cling to excuses. He repented. Psalm 51 bears the cry of a broken man seeking mercy, not justification. His words reveal not a king defending his right to rule, but a soul laid bare before his Creator. The Psalms, many attributed to David, capture the spectrum of human emotion: joy, sorrow, fear, longing, and praise. They were not written in ivory towers, but in caves, courts, and fields. They give voice to the complexity of the human heart, in communion with the divine. In moments of triumph, David exalts God as refuge and deliverer. In times of despair, he asks why God seems distant, yet through every line runs a thread of trust. The Psalms became Israel's prayer book, shaping worship and theology for generations. Solomon, David's son, inherited a kingdom united and prosperous. Known for his wisdom, he asked not for riches or vengeance, but for understanding. God granted his request, and Solomon became renowned across the ancient world. The Queen of Sheba traveled to witness the wonder of his court. He composed proverbs, administered justice, and built the temple, a permanent dwelling for the presence of God, replacing the portable tabernacle of the wilderness. This temple became the center of national worship, a symbol of divine favor and stability. Yet beneath the golden exterior, cracks began to form. Solomon's heart, though wise, drifted. He married foreign wives, not merely as political alliances, but with devotion to their gods. He built high places for idol worship, directly violating the command to serve God alone. The man who had written so profoundly about wisdom began to live foolishly. His reign, while glorious on the surface, carried seeds of future division. The wealth and forced labor required to sustain his projects bred discontent. The kingdom, though not yet fractured, was growing brittle. The Proverbs, attributed in large part to Solomon, reflect the ideals he once upheld. They speak of discipline, integrity, humility, and the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom. They offer practical insight into relationships, justice, and leadership. Yet reading them alongside Solomon's life presents a poignant contrast. Wisdom known does not always become wisdom lived. His writings remind us that truth can be proclaimed even by those who do not fully embody it, and that the call to live righteously is one we must answer daily, not simply understand intellectually. The rise of kings brought both structure and peril. Israel now had a monarchy like other nations, but it also faced the temptations that came with centralized power, wealth, and prestige. The hearts of kings shaped the heart of the nation. When aligned with God, they brought blessing. When turned aside, they led the people into darkness. The monarchy revealed both the potential and the danger of human authority. It showed that leadership without surrender becomes tyranny, and that even the greatest kings are still men in need of grace. The golden age of Israel, though radiant in memory, carried within it the foreshadowing of division. The throne that once unified the tribes would soon become a source of strife. The longing for a righteous king, a king who would rule with justice, peace, and permanence, remained unmet. The Psalms echo this longing, not just for national stability, but for divine kingship that would one day rise above the failures of men. The weight of Solomon's crown had not only impressed the world with its splendor, it had also cracked the foundation beneath it. After his death, the facade of unity shattered. The golden era gave way to political unrest, and the very thing Israel had once longed for, a kingdom like the nations, now became its downfall. The tribes fractured. What had been one nation under David and Solomon became two, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This was not a mere political split, but a spiritual unraveling, exposing the fragility of a people whose identity had begun to drift from covenant to culture, from faithfulness to self-interest. Jeroboam, the first king of the north, wasted no time in securing his rule through spiritual compromise. Fearing that continued pilgrimage to Jerusalem might reawaken national unity, he established rival worship centers in Bethel and Dan. He crafted golden calves, eerily reminiscent of the one Aaron had made in the wilderness, and told the people these were the gods who brought them out of Egypt. In doing so, he did not reject religion, but distorted it. This distortion would set a pattern that subsequent kings would only deepen. The northern kingdom plunged headlong into idolatry, and although politically successful for a time, it spiraled morally and spiritually with alarming speed. In Judah, where the Davidic line continued, the situation was no less volatile. Though there were moments of reform and revival under kings like Asa, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and Josiah, they were temporary respites in an overall decline. Many of Judah's kings followed the same path as their northern counterparts, tolerating or even encouraging the worship of foreign gods, building altars on high places, and turning blind eyes to the cries of the oppressed. Justice became selective, and religion became ritual, devoid of relationship. The temple remained, the sacrifices continued, but the heart of the people was far from God. In this bleak and often chaotic landscape, prophets arose, not as political figures or ceremonial priests, but as divine voices calling the people back to the covenant. These were not popular preachers with comforting words. They were disruptors, poets of fire, and visionaries who often lived on the margins, risking their lives to speak the truth. Elijah stood atop Mount Carmel, confronting the prophets of Baal and summoning fire from heaven, not to display spectacle, but to reassert who the true God was. He did not win favor with kings or bask in applause. He fled for his life, hid in caves, and wept under trees, overwhelmed by loneliness and rejection. Elisha, his successor, carried the prophetic mantle with miracles and mercy. He healed lepers, raised the dead, and revealed divine strategies during wartime. His ministry, though less dramatic than Elijah's in some ways, demonstrated the ongoing presence of God among a people drifting further into apostasy. The prophets did not merely predict, they protested. They saw the rot beneath the rituals, the injustice behind the incense, and the corruption within the courts. Their words were often poetic, but their message was piercing: return to the Lord, or face the consequences of your choices. Among the prophetic voices, Isaiah rose with a vision that spanned both judgment and hope. He walked naked through the streets as a sign, pronounced woe after woe upon corrupt leaders, and yet also declared that a child would be born, a son given, and the government would rest upon his shoulders. He saw beyond the present devastation to a future restoration, where swords would become plowshares and wolves would lie with lambs. His language soared because his vision was rooted not in what was, but in what could be if the people turned back to their God. Jeremiah, often called the weeping prophet, lived in a time when hope seemed all but extinguished. He was called from youth, commanded not to marry, beaten, imprisoned, and ridiculed for delivering messages no one wanted to hear. Yet he spoke with unrelenting faithfulness. His laments were raw, his indictments sharp. He saw the heart of Judah's decay and knew that judgment was inevitable. Yet his tears revealed the heart of God, a heart not eager to punish, but aching for return. He watched the temple desecrated and knew its presence would not save the people if their hearts remained rebellious. His voice thundered in the streets, but it trembled with sorrow. The prophets were not uniform in style or tone, but they shared a burden. They did not serve kings or courts, they served the living God. Their primary concern was not national prosperity, but covenant fidelity. They addressed idolatry not simply as a failure of worship, but as a breakdown of the entire moral order. Where idols multiplied, so did injustice. Widows were neglected, orphans were abused, and the poor were exploited. The prophets insisted that true worship could not be separated from ethical living. God did not desire more sacrifices. He desired hearts that sought justice, loved mercy, and walked humbly. Despite their persistent warnings, the people rarely listened. The prophets were mocked, marginalized, and misunderstood. Yet even as judgment loomed, the prophetic word did not end in despair. Time and again, woven through declarations of ruin, were promises of restoration. The imagery of exile was accompanied by visions of return. The God who sent fire also promised healing. The covenant had been broken, but the covenant maker had not abandoned his plan. The division of the kingdom, the rise of idolatry, and the spiraling injustice revealed more than a national crisis. It exposed the deep fractures in the human heart. The longing for a king had led to kings who failed. The desire for control had led to chaos. Yet through the voices of the prophets, a different kind of kingdom was being envisioned. Not one built on gold or military might, but one built on righteousness, peace, and the knowledge of God. The warnings had been relentless. Prophets cried aloud in marketplaces, wept in temple courts, and confronted kings behind palace walls. They had spoken of covenant violation, of injustice buried beneath ritual, of idolatry standing where holiness once reigned. Yet despite centuries of patient pleading from the God who had delivered them from Egypt and given them a home, the hearts of the people remained unmoved. The temple still stood, but its significance had been hollowed out. The rituals continued, but reverence had faded. The covenant had been reduced to custom. Eventually, the weight of rebellion reached its tipping point, and judgment, long delayed, fell. Babylon did not strike like a sudden storm. Its approach was gradual, calculated, and total, Wave after wave of invasion weakened Judah's defenses. The final siege brought devastation that would mark the soul of the nation for generations. Jerusalem was breached. The temple, once filled with the glory of the Lord, was stripped and set aflame. Sacred vessels were stolen, the altar was defiled, the ark was gone. The very place where heaven once touched earth through smoke and song became rubble under foreign boots. The city of David was reduced to a landscape of ruin. The people were taken into exile, not just the powerful and educated, but craftsmen, priests, poets, and prophets. They were dragged away from the land promised to Abraham, away from the throne of David, away from the temple built by Solomon. Their identity, once rooted in geography and sacred structure, was now tested by displacement. No more sacrifices, no more festivals, no more kings from the line of David. The grief was not merely personal, it was national, spiritual, and generational. The land, the temple, and the throne were gone, and yet something deeper endured. The Book of Lamentations stands as the most poignant expression of this collective heartbreak. Its verses do not minimize suffering, but inhabit it fully. The city is personified as a widow, her beauty faded, her dignity stripped away. Children cry out for food, priests are slain in the streets. The once proud inhabitants are now refugees in chains. Yet even in this river of sorrow, there is a current of quiet faith. The poet confesses, through tears, that the mercies of God are new every morning. Though surrounded by despair, he dares to hope not because of circumstance, but because of character, because the Lord is faithful even when everything else is lost. During this same exile, voices began to rise, not in Jerusalem, but in the very heart of Babylon. Ezekiel, a priest turned prophet, received visions that defied imagination. He saw the glory of God on the move, no longer confined to the temple, but riding on wheels of fire and filled with eyes, reaching into exile. He enacted prophecies with his own body, cutting his hair, building models, lying on his side for months to demonstrate the judgment of God and his coming redemption. In one of the most powerful images, he stood in a valley filled with dry bones and was commanded to speak. As he prophesied, the bones came together, flesh formed, and breath returned. It was a vision not just of resurrection, but of national restoration. God had not forgotten his people. Even in exile, he was speaking, promising to give them a new heart and a new spirit. Daniel, exiled as a young man, became a figure of wisdom and integrity in the courts of pagan kings. He interpreted dreams that revealed the rise and fall of empires. He refused to bow to idols or cease praying to his God, even when threatened with death. He was thrown into a lion's den and emerged untouched, not by force, but by faith. His visions extended beyond his own time, speaking of kingdoms that would rise like beasts and of a coming ruler unlike any other, a son of man who would reign forever. Daniel was not a warrior, but a witness, and through him God declared that empires might rise and fall, but his purposes remain unshaken. The exile became the crucible in which the people of Israel were refined. Without the temple, they turned to the Torah. Without the land, they turned to memory. Without the king, they turned to promise. Synagogues emerged as centers of worship and instruction. Teachers and scribes began preserving and interpreting scripture with renewed urgency. The idea of holiness was no longer tied to a place, but to a people set apart, even in foreign soil. The covenant was remembered not just through sacrifice, but through prayer, study, and obedience. Though exile felt like abandonment, it was, in fact, the discipline of a father refusing to let his children destroy themselves. It was not punishment for the sake of wrath, but correction for the sake of restoration. Prophets like Jeremiah, who had seen the destruction firsthand, wrote letters to the exiles, urging them to settle in the land, to build homes, plant gardens, raise families. He reminded them that their situation, while painful, was not permanent. He spoke of 70 years after which God would bring them back. His words were not empty, they were filled with divine certainty. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope. This hope was not just about returning to a ruined city, it was about being remade. The exile taught them that God's presence does not depend on location. He had walked with them in the wilderness, spoken from burning bushes, appeared in foreign dreams, and now he was present even in Babylon. They learned to carry their faith into unfamiliar places, to sing the songs of Zion beside rivers that did not know their name, to trust that if God had been faithful in Egypt, in Sinai, in the land, he could be faithful in exile too. The Old Testament presents exile as both judgment and mercy. It is the consequence of choices made, but it is also the setting for promises renewed. In their lowest place, the people discovered that what could be burned, lost, or conquered was never the foundation of their identity. The real temple was the word in their hearts. The real kingdom was the one still to come. And though they had lost their land, their temple, and their freedom, they had not lost their God. 70 years had passed since Jerusalem's fall, and for many, Babylon was no longer exile. It was home. Entire generations had been born in foreign lands, raised among unfamiliar customs, and had never set eyes on the city their ancestors once mourned. The trauma of conquest had faded into memory, yet the promises of God remained. The words spoken by the prophets of return, of rebuilding, of hope beyond desolation, lingered in the hearts of those who still believed that history was not finished. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the door swung open. The great Persian Empire rose to dominance, and its king, Cyrus, issued a decree that would change the course of the exiles' lives forever. Not by force or rebellion, but by royal edict, the people of Israel were allowed to return to their land. The journey back to Jerusalem was not marked by the grand pageantry one might expect after such a long captivity. There were no triumphant processions, no military escort, no overflowing treasuries. Those who returned did so not because of political advantage or social ease, but because of faith. They left behind the relative security of Persia to face the ruins of a city that had once been great, but now lay in broken heaps. What awaited them was not glory but labor, rebuilding walls, clearing debris, restoring worship. Yet every stone lifted, every altar repaired, was an act of defiance against despair and a declaration that God was not finished with his people. Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, led the first wave. His focus was on the temple, the sacred heart of Israel's identity. Though the former temple had been magnificent, built with resources and alliances Solomon had secured during his reign, this new structure would be modest by comparison. As the foundation was laid, the sound of weeping mingled with shouts of joy. The younger generation rejoiced at a future taking shape before their eyes, while the elders wept for what had been lost. It was a moment both sacred and sorrowful, hope wrapped in the memory of former glory. The prophet Haggai rose during this time, speaking with urgency and clarity. He called out the people for allowing their personal homes to be rebuilt while the house of the Lord remained in ruins. His words pierced through the complacency that had settled in. Revival, he reminded them, does not begin with comfort. It begins with prioritizing the presence of God. Alongside him, Zechariah offered visions filled with symbolism and future promises. He saw a high priest clothed in filthy garments, cleansed and restored, a lampstand burning with divine oil, and a coming king who would enter Jerusalem not with military force, but riding on a donkey. His messages reached far beyond brick and mortar, pointing to a spiritual renewal that would one day encompass not just Israel, but all nations. Years later, under the leadership of Ezra, the focus turned from construction to instruction. A scribe skilled in the law of Moses, Ezra understood that true restoration could not be accomplished by walls and rituals alone. It had to reach the heart. Upon returning to Jerusalem, he gathered the people and read the law aloud. As they listened, many wept, not because of nostalgia, but because they realized how far they had drifted from the ways of their ancestors. Ezra's mission was not merely academic, it was deeply pastoral. He led reforms, confronted sin, and called for a renewed commitment to covenant living. Through him, the centrality of Scripture was re-established, and the foundations of what would later become Judaism began to solidify. Nehemiah, a cupbearer to the Persian king, followed soon after. His concern was practical yet spiritual. Upon hearing that Jerusalem's walls remained in disrepair, he sought and received royal permission to return and rebuild. His leadership was marked by resolve, prayer, and a fierce determination to complete the work despite constant opposition. The threats came not only from outside enemies, but from within: discouragement, fatigue, and internal corruption. Nehemiah faced each challenge with wisdom and unshakable focus. He armed workers with tools in one hand and weapons in the other, symbolizing the need to build while remaining vigilant. Under his watch, the walls were completed in 52 days, a feat that astonished surrounding nations and testified to divine favor. As society was reformed, a deeper hunger began to emerge, a longing for something more than just a rebuilt city or reinstituted rituals. The people sensed that while they had returned to their land and repaired the structures of their faith, the promises of God still pointed forward. Malachi, the final prophetic voice of the Old Testament, addressed this tension. He confronted the priests for offering blemished sacrifices, challenged the people's hypocrisy, and exposed the weariness that had crept into their worship. Yet he also spoke of a coming day when the Sun of Righteousness would rise with healing in its wings, and a messenger would prepare the way for the Lord. His words did not resolve the longing, they intensified it. The return from exile was not the end of the story. It was a re-beginning, a resetting of the stage. The people had learned that temples can fall, kings can fail, and rituals can become hollow. But they had also learned that God remains faithful, that exile does not mean abandonment, and that broken things can be rebuilt. The prophets reminded them that the true fulfillment of the promises was still ahead, not just in the restoration of land, but in the arrival of a Messiah who would fulfill every shadow and silence of the story so far. Though Jerusalem stood once more and sacrifices were offered again, there remained a holy tension, a sense that the great crescendo of the story had not yet come. The people watched, waited, and whispered the words of the prophets as they passed them from generation to generation. The story was not over. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was expectation. The final words of the prophet Malachi echoed into a long and uneasy silence. The voice that had thundered through Sinai, wept through Jeremiah, and envisioned hope through Isaiah had now grown quiet. No prophet arose, no divine message interrupted the steady march of history. For 4 centuries, the heavens did not speak in the way they once had, and yet the silence was not a void. It was a waiting space, dense with tension, heavy with preparation. Though the canon of the Old Testament closed, the hand of God did not rest. History moved with deliberate force, shaping a world into which the long-awaited Messiah would be born. As Persia gave way to Greece, the influence of Hellenistic culture spread rapidly across the known world. When Alexander the Great's conquests reached Judea, the land of the covenant found itself once again under foreign rule. Greek language, philosophy, and customs began to seep into Jewish life, often clashing with the ancestral traditions that had defined their identity for centuries. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured, and Judea became a contested region between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties. It was during this period that tensions reached a boiling point. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, in a campaign to unify his kingdom through culture and religion, aggressively enforced Hellenization. He banned Jewish practices, desecrated the temple by erecting an altar to Zeus, and even sacrificed a pig upon it, a deliberate affront to everything sacred in Jewish law. The outrage this caused sparked the Maccabean revolt, a fierce and unexpected uprising led by the priestly family of Mattathias and his son Judah Maccabee. Against all odds, the Jewish rebels drove out the Seleucids, rededicated the temple, and restored a measure of independence. This victory became the foundation for the festival of Hanukkah, a celebration of light rekindled amid darkness. In the aftermath, the Hasmonean dynasty emerged, blending religious authority with political power. For a time, there was Jewish self-governance, but it came at a cost. Internal divisions grew, and the fusion of priesthood and kingship created tensions that would echo well into the New Testament period. As the Hasmoneans expanded their influence, questions arose about legitimacy and purity, questions that would soon divide the Jewish world into factions with sharply different visions for the future. By the time Rome entered the scene, taking control of Judea in 63 BCE, Jewish society was deeply fragmented. The Pharisees, rising from the ashes of exile and emphasizing the oral traditions and purity of the law, sought to apply Torah to every aspect of life, making faith a living practice even under foreign rule. They believed in resurrection, angels, and the coming of the Messiah, and they were popular among the common people. In contrast, the Sadducees, who controlled the temple and maintained close ties with Roman authorities, rejected many of the oral traditions and emphasized the written law alone. They did not believe in resurrection or spiritual beings, and their influence was largely confined to the priestly elite. Alongside these, other groups emerged. The Essenes, a separatist sect disillusioned by the corruption of the temple and priesthood, withdrew to the desert, dedicating themselves to asceticism, prayer, and the copying of sacred texts. Their writings, preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, reveal a community fervently waiting for two messianic figures, a priestly and a royal redeemer. Meanwhile, the Zealots adopted a more radical stance, preparing to resist Roman occupation through armed rebellion. For them, faith and freedom were inseparable, and they would not hesitate to shed blood in the name of national and spiritual liberation. Amid this swirl of politics, religion, and revolution, the Jewish people carried an unquenchable hope. The prophets had spoken of a coming one, a servant, a king, a shepherd, a light to the nations. Though centuries had passed, those promises had not been forgotten. In synagogues across the diaspora, the scriptures were read, studied, and cherished. Children were taught to expect the coming of Elijah, to look for signs to prepare the way. The longing for redemption grew deeper with each passing generation. Though the language changed from Hebrew to Aramaic and later to Greek and Latin, the heart of the people remained tethered to the promise. It was during this period that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, was produced. For many Jews living outside of Israel, Greek had become the common language. The translation made the sacred texts accessible to the wider world and laid a foundation that would later help spread the gospel across empires. The scriptures began to travel with the people, and the seeds of a global faith were quietly sown in foreign lands. Though no prophet stood in the temple courts and no divine fire fell from heaven, history itself began to take on the shape of divine orchestration. The roads built by Rome, the shared language established by Greece, the dispersed Jewish communities across cities and continents, all of it formed a network prepared for a message not yet spoken. The silence was not God's absence, but his patience. Like a stage being set before the drama begins, the world was being prepared for something that would not merely continue the story, but fulfill it. In the waiting, faith was not extinguished. It was refined. Prayers rose from kitchen tables and synagogue pulpits. Psalms were whispered in alleys and sung in temple courts. The longing for deliverance became the heartbeat of a people who had endured exile, oppression, and internal failure. Their resilience was not rooted in optimism, but in covenant. The God who had spoken through fire and storm, who had delivered through sea and wilderness, would speak again. And when he did, the silence of 400 years would be broken by a cry in the wilderness and a voice calling out, "Prepare the way of the Lord." Though the Old Testament ends with Malachi and the world moves into a period of prophetic silence, the story itself does not conclude. It waits. And as that waiting stretches across generations, a thread dyed in scarlet can be traced through every page that came before. This thread is not a metaphor, not a clever literary device, but a divine design woven from Eden to exile, from promise to Passover, from wilderness to worship. It points forward, steadily and faithfully, towards someone greater than the prophets, higher than the kings, and holier than the priests. From the moment sin entered the garden, a whisper of redemption was heard. Genesis 3 contains not only the account of humanity's fall, but also the first glimpse of a redeemer, the seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head. That promise, spoken in the shadow of shame, sets in motion a divine pursuit that flows through every generation. When God calls Abraham, he speaks of a blessing for all nations, a foreshadowing of the one who would later be called the light of the world. When the Passover lamb is slain and blood marks the doorposts in Egypt, it is not only a symbol of deliverance from bondage, but a portrait of the Lamb who would one day take away the sin of the world. The tabernacle, with its layers of curtains, sacred objects, and restricted access, was never the destination. It was a shadow of something greater. Every priest who entered, every sacrifice offered, and every ritual performed was a reflection, a copy of a deeper reality. The high priest passed through the veil once a year, but a day would come when the true high priest would tear that veil in two, not with hands, but with blood and obedience. The wilderness, where the people grumbled and God provided, became a place where the presence of the future Christ could be glimpsed. He was the manna that sustained, the water from the rock, the bronze serpent lifted up to bring healing to those who would look. In Joshua, we see a leader who brings the people into the promised land. But it is only a temporary home. There remains a greater rest, one that only Jesus would provide. The judges failed, the kings fell, and the prophets often spoke to deaf ears, yet through them all the promise endured. David, though flawed, was given a covenant that one of his descendants would reign forever. The Psalms, many written in his voice, became the songs that Jesus himself would later quote. Psalm 22 does not merely describe suffering, it anticipates the cross. Psalm 110 does not simply exalt a king, it points to one who would sit at the right hand of the Father. The wisdom of Proverbs, the longing of Ecclesiastes, and the passion of Song of Songs each echo the character and purpose of Christ. Isaiah sees him as the suffering servant, pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Jeremiah calls him the righteous branch. Ezekiel speaks of a shepherd who will gather the scattered. Daniel sees one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. Even in exile, even in judgment, the scarlet thread never disappears. It reappears in visions, in poems, in dreams, and in the persistent hope of a people who have lost everything but have not been forgotten. The Messiah was not a New Testament invention. He is the fulfillment of everything the Old Testament longed for, cried out for, and pointed toward. When he walks the road to Emmaus after his resurrection, he does not begin with the miracles or the cross. He begins with Moses and all the prophets, interpreting to his followers the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. Jesus is not added to the story, he is the story. Every page of the Old Testament, when read with eyes of faith, reveals a portrait of the one to come. In genealogies, he is the descendant of Abraham and David. In law, he is the righteous standard. In prophecy, he is the voice crying in the wilderness. In poetry, he is the fulfillment of every longing. In suffering, he is the man of sorrows. In glory, he is the king who will reign in righteousness. He is the seed, the lamb, the rock, the branch, the light, the Lord. The Old Testament is not complete without him, not because it lacks meaning, but because he is the meaning. It is not just a record of what happened, it is a revelation of who God is and what he planned from the very beginning. Every judgment, every deliverance, every exile, every return prepares the way for the arrival of the one who would not simply speak God's word, but who would be the Word made flesh. The silence ends with a cry in Bethlehem, but the story had been speaking of him all along. If this journey through the Old Testament has opened your eyes to the beauty, the depth, and the divine unity of Scripture, we invite you to go deeper. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss future content that brings the Bible to life with clarity and purpose. If this video encouraged or challenged you, please click the like button. It helps more people discover this message. Leave a comment below and share what part of the Old Testament has impacted you the most. And most importantly, share this video with friends, family, or anyone who might be searching for hope, answers, or a deeper understanding of God's story. Because this story, his story, is our story, and it is far from over, and it